All right. Welcome back to Gamecool Books, and welcome in particular to Kevin Hensler. Hi,
Hey, how are you?
I'm great. How are you doing?
Doing pretty well. Excited to be here.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to have you. Like we were just talking about a minute ago, I found you back in October, so several months ago now. I was going through some blogs of people who are connected with Signum University,
hmm
and you were listed as having given a talk or led a panel at
hmm
one of their myth moots on the strange and sophisticated materialist theology of Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials. So that's, I don't know how many years ago now that you wrote that paper and gave that panel. But maybe just tell us, like,
Or five, I don't really remember. Um,
where did you first meet, come across Philip Pullman, or come across Signum University, or both? How did that come
yeah.
about?
Okay, so the two stories. I came across Philip Pullman a long time ago. I think I was early in seventh grade, and like a lot of the book series in my life, read, um, probably embarrassingly so. A girl I kind of had a crush on was reading *The Subtle Knife*. And I decided, okay, she's reading that book. I'll read that book too.
Very dangerous.
About yeah, and I got like really into it, and then I wanted to read *The Golden Compass*, and this was before *The Amber Spyglass* came out. I got really into *The Subtle Knife*. That was so interesting. And then when I read *The Golden Compass* is just a whole *The Northern Lights*. It's just a whole new experience. It's I would always say that *The Subtle Knife* did a lot of really interesting things, but the real heart of Pullman's world building is in *The Golden Compass*. That's where that's where, instead of just sort of playing around with sort of intellectual ideas, he is just rather just sort of like pulling in all the whimsy. And yes, he's got sort of didactic goals ultimately, but they don't take over in that book. They don't really take over until *The Amber Spyglass*. And when he's just sort of embracing his whimsy and pulling in the wonder of this world he's created, and you connect so well with the characters and you experience it through them. It's just incredible. And after I read those two, and I think I probably read *The Subtle Knife* again after *The Golden Compass*, I was really excited waiting for the *Amber Spyglass* to come out, and I was really excited. I pre-ordered that like before pre-ordering was a thing, and I made sure I got that right away. And that was, at the time, it was a little bit of a letdown because, first of all, I felt really awkward reading that book as a Catholic in a way I did not when I read *The Golden Compass* and *The Subtle Knife*.
Mm.
But I definitely enjoyed it, and I still appreciate it. I think it's still the weakest of those three books. Mm-hmm.
And then
Hard.
you wrote this paper at some point later on, as a student in college or in your grad program, or
Yeah, so I mean, I've been a graduate student forever. I'm a graduate student now in religion. I was at the time a graduate student in Semitic languages and literature, but I've got a background in theology, and I was really interested in Philip Pullman's work as sort of constructing or holding on to a theology, and it really is a theology. And what really interested me is how he's dealing with these spiritual realities of like ghosts and souls, which are taking animal form, and they're demons, but they're definitely mystical in some way. They're supernatural by any standard, and yet he describes them being made of atoms.
yeah,
So he's pulled the supernatural world into nature, and he's sort of defining it by nature. And in *The Amber Spyglass*, when the ghosts leave and go back to the living world, their atoms fly apart, and it's just like the spirit is nothing else except sort of like almost like vaporous matter, and it's really interesting. And yet somehow the spirit was there all the time. There's a lot there.
well, so I think at some point in that third book, maybe it's Mary Malone, the ex-nun, who
Mhm.
says that there's a good sort of theological basis for this idea of the body, the soul, and the spirit. Um, I'm not as familiar with that terminology. I don't know if you're familiar with such a formulation, but it does seem like there's a kind of coherence between whatever it is that makes up the human being in Pullman's world, and that what he's concerned with is the ways in which that coherence can be broken, right, and broken apart and perverted even, right? So I think I see what you mean by a theology, right? That he's kind of wading into those waters.
Yeah, it's dealing with like sort of the fundamental nature of all reality in light of whatever the deepest reality is. And I'm not exactly sure what that is. What is sort of underlies all existence. It seems like the source of the source of all sort of self-comprehension, which is sort of like what dust is a manifestation of in Pullman's world, is matter recognizing itself, which is almost like, is that just sort of an accident? And once that happens, then things start to have meaning in Pullman's world. And there's no underlying meaning until that happens. And then once that happens completely by accident, there just is meaning assigned to things. Is this kind of like almost like an existentialism that's not existentialist? Like there is true meaning, but it doesn't come about until matter comprehends itself by accident?
I think that Pullman does stand pretty firmly with the idea that there is such a thing as meaning, and that it matters, in a kind of essential way, right? Like not a way that is trivial. I
Yeah,
don't.
but does not seem to be like any type of nihilist.
Yeah.
He rejects Christianity, and he rejects sort of like the oppression that he perceives religion to be, and that religion all too often has been. And yet, in a lot of ways, he's got kind of the same sort of underlying meaning in the world that he perceives as someone who is religious, rather than someone who is sort of just like a determinist. It's really interesting. There's a lot of tension there. I've been interested in it ever since I first read it, and as I've learned more and I go back to it, I just find the incredible richness and the strangeness of Pullman clearly having these experiences that to me have been religious, and yet sort of like moving away from religion and seeing religion as the problem. And I try to sort of recategorize how he's thinking about that for himself, since he's not religious, and it's really it's fascinating to me, and I'm not sure I fully comprehend it.
No, I certainly am with you on that, and I wonder if maybe this would be a good part to kind of transition into a little bit of your studies of religion more generally. Clearly, you've read quite a bit and studied quite a bit. So what kinds of things do you study, and are you specializing in at this point? And kind of how did you come to that track? And yeah, does it sort of shed some light on some of these questions of ultimate ground of reality and all that good stuff?
Okay, well, I guess I've always been really interested in ancient things. I love the ancient world. I love sort of like looking for origins, and I think that in Pullman's work, it's so deep, and you don't ever get to the origins. And I think if you ever really did, if I found out how everything really worked, I think it might ultimately just be dissatisfying unless it really is sort of infinitely deep. And I don't know whether that is the case, but the quest for like searching, going back and back and back, it's so romantic, it's so wonderful. And so that's sort of like I really was interested in classical mythology. I really was interested in the Bible, but primarily not really the Bible as a religious text, just sort of like the myths in it that pull you so far back, and how it was written and how this all got together. And I really, like, I never was like a biblical literalist. I never was a creationist. I never had that. Well, I mean, I guess depending on what you mean by creationist, I was never a young earth creationist. That was never sort of in the cards for me. So the Bible always sort of had this mythic quality, and that didn't mean that it was fundamentally untrue in any way. In fact, if anything, I still would say that is fundamentally truer in a way that is just sort of different from sort of historical fact. And the Bible was, when I was in like 8th grade, what I decided like I wanted to, do with my life. And that's kind of because I always knew I wanted to be an academic, probably even before that. Maybe because I was into like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis even before I was interested in all of that stuff. And I just really sort of like wanted to emulate their lifestyles. like by the time I was in like 5th grade, as little as I actually knew about it, and as little as I actually knew what the academic life was like, I'm just like, I want to do that. And then the Bible was sort of the area that I sort of honed in on for that. The reason might be that I really didn't like my English teachers. That's not really the teacher's fault. I didn't really like my English classes, I should say, until much later. Whereas I kind of did my own thing when I was like reading the Bible, and I was just like, oh, that English stuff, like making me read all the Dickens, and all like I don't know, all the British lit that's not interesting to me. Now I've in my later life, I've definitely gotten more respect for Dickens, but at the time it was not pulling me there. But I could sort of pursue the literary interests I had in the field of religion, and that's what I did. I decided I wanted to study the Bible and religion, and when I got to college, I did that. The curriculum at my undergrad for that also required lots of studies of world religion, and I just love them too, and I absorbed them voraciously. And I've kind of been doing things with that ever since, with a primary focus on the Bible and really the mythology in the Bible, but just so many secondary areas that I just pull in. And love it. And in fact, I probably like teaching world religion just as much as I like teaching Hebrew Bible. Maybe more. Maybe I don't know. I love them both. I also would love to teach like sort of a theology through literature course at some point in my life.
Uh-huh.
That would be wonderful. That would be incredible. I might even pull Pullman in and talk about that. That would be super cool.
I mean, I think that he would be a really interesting factor in such a course, given his avowed disdain for certain religious
You would think of it.
consequences of religion, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I mean, your passion for this stuff is really palpable, and Pullman's disgust for religion is equally, clear in his statements and things he says about his work. And so I'm curious if that's part of why maybe he doesn't go into as much detail with a kind of origin story, a cosmogony for his worlds. And a lot of things are sort of they're maybe mutually reinforcing, but there isn't a clear cause for a lot of it. And maybe he couldn't give one if you asked him for one. He might not even know.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think he also, I think there's really a lot of tension in his work, and sometimes it really works well and is really cool, and sometimes it's sort of like a little bit sort of the tension is too much and it kind of tips over. I think when he deals with I think he was really enamored by the idea of like God being the first being, but not being like the source of other beings and then deceiving them. And that he sort of did that. He ran with that in the Amber Spyglass, and which of course, by my definition, would make that being not God being sort of an ontologically distinct thing from just sort of another more powerful, more knowledgeable being. So he's enamored by that, and so he sort of doesn't have a source for existence and a sort of a fundamental ground of meaning. He just sort of has meaning emerge and then be real in the form of dust when matter comes to know itself, as I said. But I think that one of the reasons for that is that he really wants there to be sort of like a cosmological origin that's traced in physics, which does not ultimately give that meaning to the world. And which, I mean, most theists that I know who are well educated have no problem with at all. They just sort of would say there's something behind that that's even deeper. But I guess he sort of just wants to have sort of the new atheist cake, to sort of be a reductive materialist and not be one at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Like matter is all there is, and yet there really is deeper. He's like almost like a Platonist who's a reductive materialist. It's really, I don't know.
I don't know what he would say about that question of the God behind the authority, right? The one that might or might not be there. I think about that question, he'd probably be sort of in the agnostic, I'm not sure, have no way of knowing.
He might be. He dislikes religion, though. Like,
but
or
he's, yeah, he's very firmly against the authority, right? The God who, as he portrays it, is,
always refer to God as the authority. Like
yeah,
that's how God has been known. That's sort of like the defining characteristic of God in Lyra's world, which
yeah.
is kind of just sort of like a more theocratic version of our world with a few things different. Um,
Well, one big difference there is, of course, is the demons,
yeah,
right? Which is
that's the
like
biggest difference. Yeah.
wonderful, but also the alternate history there. It's a small thing. In one of the first chapters, they mention that John Calvin
Mhm.
became the Pope
And then
at a certain point, and that sort of gave the form to the church as it exists, in Lyra's time period, which is more or less, contemporaneous with ours.
Catholic Protestant Reformed Church. And Calvin, I think he often is misunderstood. I mean, I'm not a Calvinist really at all, but I think that he is a more moderate theologian than his sort of like reading his claims literally would sort of convey him to be. And yet, sort of if you read the words, he is really down on the world. And he really does have a theology that lends itself to this idea of the authority, almost like pushing humans down, ultimately almost for no reason, like just to feel good about themselves. Like, why is the authority and why are his angels suppressing human knowledge? It's to better control humans, but why better control humans? Ultimately, not for any real reason. Like, what do they benefit from that? Just to sort of like, it makes them feel better in their sort of like demented desire to like be in charge.
Yeah.
And one thing that's really interesting though, so I'm teaching Genesis, I'm teaching the early chapters of Genesis. One of the themes in the early chapters of Genesis is a God that sounds exactly like that, right? Why does God banish man and woman from the garden? It's not as a punishment. It's to keep them from reaching up to get the fruit of the tree of life, because they've already eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And basically, once you have immortality and great knowledge, you are basically the same thing as God, and God doesn't want anyone equal to him. And it's really interesting, and that's why he tears down the Tower of Babel, to stop humans from getting to heaven and basically being like God. That's this consistent theme in those early chapters of Genesis. Now, that's a complex text with a complex history, but Pullman didn't make that up.
Yeah.
He just sort of like made that the whole picture when there's a lot more going on.
Well, he doesn't do much with
Yeah.
a lot of what's in the Bible, but particularly the New Testament is kind of left out. But
Oh, I don't know if he mentions Jesus at all.
yeah, and the thing I was gonna say about Calvin, the thing that most people know about him, if they know things about him, is that he was big on predestination, right?
Yeah, double predestination. Yeah. So
So, so this is something I think that is another tension, no matter what you believe, this problem of free will and determinism or providence, whatever sort of place you fall on that spectrum. Anyway, there's going to be tension there, right? And in Pullman's work, he does something really interesting where he acknowledges it quite explicitly up front, having people discuss the sort of great importance of Lyra's choices
mhm.
within a framework of a great sort of destiny or prophecy surrounding her. We hear it first from the master of Jordan, because he's got some knowledge from the alethiometer, and then we hear it later from the witch consul, Dr. Lancelius, and he speaks of how the witches hear whispers from other worlds through the aurora, right, where the matter is thin. This element of prophecy and free choice, along with your point about like the bad guy who wants control, those
Mhm.
both sound really similar to no one so much as Tolkien, right? Like that sounds like quite comparable, actually. And I know you've studied Tolkien quite a bit. You mentioned. So what do you make of that ball of wax?
Oh yeah. Well, that sort of is like Pullman is making of God what Pullman would make of his devil figure. Someone who's obsessed with control, almost for its own end, to ultimately no benefit to him. And that's sort of what the authority, that's the role the authority is playing for Pullman. And it's kind of like, I've decided that I'm against religion, but I'm still going to ultimately come down exactly where other scholars that are similar to me are about like what's good and what's evil. I'm just sort of going to sort of flip who's what. But yeah, there's a exact parallel there. The authority is just like Morgoth, except that there's no Iluvatar who is behind the scenes, that is sort of like the source of all everything, who is sort of the ultimate master controller, who is not sort of pursuing his power, but sort of just like his power is a reality behind everything. Who and also sort of Iluvatar fundamentally gives everyone free will. It's just sort of like your free will is absolutely free, but there's nothing you can do to change things so that they're not like ultimately what God wants.
Yeah.
And maybe that's oppressive. Maybe Pullman would read that as oppressive, but it's certainly not the way he depicts the authority.
See, I just don't think Pullman has read Tolkien all that carefully, is the sense I get. That he, like his
Must have read Tolkien, yeah.
yeah, I think that he's read, or enough to decide that he has some problems with, yeah, those kind of markers that you point out, right? I guess there's also a big difference between the two with respect to their approach to fantasy.
Yeah.
Something that he, again, is very vocal about, that he wants to be read as a writer who is concerned with real people, not invented people. But as you said, part of what makes the story so compelling is this invented world with
Yeah.
witches, bears, demons,
Invented people, yeah. Absolutely.
So there's a lot of interesting tensions there. But I just want to come back to the prophecy one. What kinds of thoughts do you have about the role of prophecy in these kinds of stories, and maybe in particular with respect to Lyra and her journey, her quest here?
Yeah, so prophecy is really interesting, and especially for Lyra. They really, one of the big things they emphasize, and Dr. Lancilius says it in the chapter in Trollesund, in the Consul there, how she is destined. She has this destiny, and yet it's not like the destiny is inevitably going to be fulfilled. In fact, it can only be fulfilled if she's free to make her own mistakes. If people guide her too much, it sounds like it will fail. Right? It sounds like she's not going to succeed if she gets too much guidance. And if she doesn't get enough guidance, or if she doesn't get guidance, she'll probably fail also. So it's sort of this near thing. It's almost like the prophecy itself is pointing to a potentiality that only she has, but there's nothing guaranteed in it. I guess.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, that there's a very interesting kind of space between her getting no guidance, right, following any whim, getting captivated by
Yeah.
Mrs. Coulter, by the scientists at Bolvanger, as happens, right? And she does need help from time to time. But on the other hand, right, not telling her directly, you have this great destiny, you must take the ring and destroy it, or whatever right. And I know that's not exactly how it goes in the Lord of the Rings, but it's much clearer, I think, there, that something is operating like that.
And there's clearly like beings working behind the scene to try and sort of like make this all work out, and there's obviously beings more overtly operating against it. But what is the ultimate destiny like? It's almost, what we find out is sort of the whole sort of climax of the third book is almost like an anticlimax, because it doesn't matter, because like it's after all like the big deal happens that like Lyra and Will apparently save the world. It's kind of just like by falling in love with each other and consummating that love, I suppose. which is really interesting, because I mean, it also says something. Why is their love particularly special? Does that mean that they felt their love much more deeply than other people do, or was there a dearth of actual love being experienced or something? That I mean, people fall in love, feel like they're like the main characters of the world all the time, and why were Lyra and Will special? I don't think we ever learn why Lyra and Will were special. Obviously, they're incredibly powerful personalities. Obviously, they would ultimately grow up to be larger than life figures, it seems. They've got sort of every bit as much will as Lyra's parents did. And but is that just it, that they're significant people who did this? Why is this like sort of the retelling of the Adam and Eve story? Why is this the fall again, but good? What's special about Lyra that she was susceptible to this in a way that no one else, by doing the exact same thing Lyra did, would have saved the world, would have brought the dust back? So what is it? I still don't think I know, and I'm not sure before this conversation I ever even thought about it.
It's
like, yeah.
It's a real, that is a real question. And again, I think Pullman has this kind of problem with the idea that there's a chosen one.
Yeah.
You know, like the Harry Potter or the Jesus Christ, for that matter, right? Whereas he also does sort of present us with what looks an awful lot like that, that there is something special, different, unique about this particular experience, which is nevertheless a universal human experience, right? That, I don't know what the mechanism per se would be exactly, but I suspect that it has to do again with the process of the human and demons connection, and with dust, and how those two things are related here. I don't know, because there's something really interesting about Will and Lyra in that they've both gone through this process of voluntarily separating from their demon.
Yeah.
They've then passed through the world of the dead, come out the other side, and not dispersed, and done this together. And they are, you know, like witches in that they've done that separation process, but unlike witches in that they are male and female, right? So normally witches take mortal, like normal, non-separated people as their lovers. And so there does seem to be, like, within the sort of plot mechanisms and things of the world, or physics of the world, there does seem to be something that is kind of different about this.
They're both from worlds that are basically, they're two people from different worlds.
Oh yeah.
Ship in a third world in a way that could never be fully realized.
Yeah.
They're passing through the dead, or the land of the dead, and sort of voluntarily separating themselves from the demon. So there are ways that they're very different, but I don't know what the causal relationship could be.
Right. Yeah. I think that we do ultimately come back to that sort of, like you said, a whimsical, a romantic theme or sort of emotion that's evoked there, rather than a hard and fast, like mathematical kind of reason for this. I think that, as you described, the third book, a lot of readers find it more didactic in some ways, more difficult, or those times when you're sort of jarred out of following the story happen more frequently and more powerfully in that book.
That's definitely true. Yeah. And there's a lot of other stuff that's jarring about that book. Time doesn't make sense in that book. Time and distance don't make any sense. You try to figure it out, and really nothing makes any sense at all. How far people have to travel, where they go, where they end up. Yeah, there's a lot of things in that book that really don't make. I mean, there's a kind of a throwaway line in the second book where Ruta Scotty says to Serafina Pekkala that Lord Asriel must be able to command time and like make it faster and slower, which is kind of like the only explanation for what we see, because it really is absurd the way time works. The way, like, I think Will crosses the entire continent of Asia in like a few days. On foot, going after Lyra, who somehow has already been there for months, which is like, what?
Right. So there, yeah, those are more or less insurmountable when you look at them in the cold light of day. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that again, like what he's going for and what he accomplishes, to me at least, I love that book still, even though I see the issues with it, and I'm interested in sort of trying to work through them as much as possible. But what he accomplishes is still like the culmination of this incredible story,
Oh,
right?
it's monumental. Yeah.
and and that ultimately is the thing that again I think unites him really closely with his forebears Lewis and Tolkien, whom he in other ways wants to distinguish himself from in lots of sort of ideological ways. They all three, tell incredible stories. That's what first
I,
sort of grabs you.
I would definitely say that his Dark Materials is one of the great works of the 20th century of sort of like English fantasy literature.
Yeah, yeah. And I wonder again, like to go back to the myth question, um, I feel like the myths are that way too. In a strange way, they are primarily like really good stories, right? And it's only later and with more sophistication that you sort of go and try to work out like, so how does this actually map onto reality, or how is it internally coherent with itself? And what does this mean for ultimate purposes, and how can we use this to control people if that's what we want to do? How can we use this to free ourselves if that's what we want to do? So all of that stuff still sort of is grafted onto, or maybe implicit in these great stories. um, I I don't know to what extent Pullman is maybe saying something about that very process. And this is, I don't know quite where to go with this thought, but it seems to me that he really wants to hold the story up as the primary thing, and all of the ideological and other sorts of accoutrements that get put on there have those kind of be dismissible to as much as possible.
And he does a really good job with that in the first two books, and especially the first book.
Yeah.
Although, I mean, you could, if you're reading it looking for anti-religion stuff, you can find it easily, but it doesn't take over the story, and in some ways it does sometimes in the third book. I'm also there are other problems with the third book too, but yeah. Yeah, and you're talking about myth, and myth is one of those really hard things to define. And in fact, that kind of, when I was doing a graduate school interview once for a spot in a kind of elite doctoral program, I kind of like got tripped up. Like, you say you're interested in studying myth. What is myth? And I'm like, oh my god, like, what do I even say, right? Um, I know, like, I know what it is when I see it, right? And Pullman is sort of creating underlying myths, but yet I'm not sure if his story is myth. I guess there's myth behind it that he doesn't fully work out, and certainly these are the kinds of stories that could become mythic for future generations. It's kind of interesting because every myth, if you're going to sort of think about it inside the story, would be less mythic to the people in the story, I guess, right? I don't know.
It's Yeah, like you said, there's some explicit references to particular real world myths, like the biblical story of Genesis,
Mhm.
I specifically like the Adam and Eve and the idea of Lyra as another Eve, right?
Yeah.
Which is not without precedent, right? That's a traditional kind of conception within certain threads of Christianity too, right? That there is this second Adam, and he has, sort of undone the death and sin that entered the world with the fall, right? So all of that is like wrapped up in there, and so that's what makes it particularly difficult to accept, maybe, that we're supposed to just enjoy the story, right? So again, a major tension there.
Yeah, but I mean, it's so awesome, and I'm really excited about like his further writings in this world.
Yeah.
I really liked what is the first one in the Book of Dust, La Belle Sauvage. I don't know
Uh-huh.
when the second one's coming out or if it has already come out. Um, I just, again, there's things he did there that are kind of like, I'm not quite sure how they're working, and the world's complicated. And I think he's kind of like more like C.S. Lewis than like Tolkien here, in that like I'm not sure everything does ultimately hold together.
Yeah.
All the different mystical things he's pulling in, but it definitely is really interesting.
Yeah.
Like,
The Belle Sauvage, incorporates the the relationship between Lyra and her father in a
Yeah,
really interesting way there. And that's one of the things in terms of like feeling jarred by the story. I think, when Asriel suddenly becomes this like self-sacrificial figure towards the end, like that's one of the hardest things to kind of swallow in a way. But maybe
that's
seeing
bad.
him, yeah, but but maybe seeing him, holding Lyra, having to be separated from her, all of that, maybe that helps a little bit. He's in this way kind of expanding the story, adding layers to and smoothing out maybe things that were, a little bit rushed or unpolished about the final book or the third book, right? Yeah. Yeah, I'm very curious to see where he goes with the whole fairy commonwealth idea, right? This like other sort of other world.
And
Um,
is that sort of like a parallel world in the same world,
yeah,
like a different world, like that is parallel,
yeah,
right? Like is fairy sort of like a sub world to the same main world as Lyra's world, but not like you wouldn't reach the fairy world with a subtle knife, right? You would get there some other like
yeah.
I don't know, or would you?
See, I think this goes along too with his little books that he's released since. He's released a little red book and a little blue book, and then he's got
Mhm.
the story of the collectors, which is like an audio only. He's very savvy about like marketing and selling books, right? And he's very open about that too. But in these books, he has these like little bits and pieces from the other worlds that have somehow like passed through windows and and I feel like that is something that he is not just using as like a cute device, but I think he's also really interested in how stories are told, of course, right? And this element of fairy is so kind of intimately tied up with storytelling, right?
Yeah,
Consciousness and how it's passed on and how it grows is so intimately tied up with storytelling that
dreamlike, right? And a lot
yeah,
less. And I mean, it's also a lot more like so when I study myths, and I kind of hold them to a different standard than I hold like modern literature, because I guess I don't expect all the answers, and I sort of get mad when I read like something written today that like leaves me so like this author didn't have this figured out. But it's the real thing is like when you're dealing with these mystical issues that humans don't really comprehend, no one has it figured out, and it's probably better to leave it unfigured out. Um, that's where you get the depth. That's where you get the whimsy. That's why um, Pullman leaves you with just that deep romance when you read him, or why Tolkien does,
mhm,
because he doesn't lay it out like it's all understood. Um,
yeah,
Certainly not by humans. Like the elves don't understand the Valar, and humans don't understand elves, right? And sometimes when you tell it from the perspective of elves, it kind of seems completely normal. And yet, if a human was experiencing any of that, it would totally be all. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot there, and that's what Pullman is doing. He's really doing that with the new Book of Dust. And I'm not sure how far he's going to go with that. But yeah,
yeah. It's a matter too of sort of deciding, since we're not elves, we don't have eternal life, a matter too of deciding like which stories to tell seems to be something he's probably kind of running up against here as he's like trying to finish telling as many of these stories as he can. He
yeah,
can only sort of fill in so much, and he has to leave certain things unexplained, possibly even unthought about, unconsidered, and
yeah.
that as you say, contributes a quality of reality to it, as
Hmm.
well. And well, all right. So as we're kind of wrapping this up, um,
Hmm.
what would you what would you most like to see explored in these next couple of books that he's working on? Reportedly finished the second one, and I think working on or almost done with the third already. What would you like to see
Yeah.
told in those stories?
Oh my gosh. Um, I don't know that I can ask for any sort of like particular clarification. I guess sort of there's that strange episode early on in the Golden Compass where Lyra sort of steals those coins, the demon coins that are with the skulls, and then she like has the night gas, and it seems like there's a real ghosts there that are like asking her, like it's almost like not just a nightmare. Maybe digging more into sort of like, you know, the parts of the dead that are not in that world of the dead, because there seems to be like some spooky stuff in that world. We got an answer for specters, but we certainly didn't get an answer for everything, right? There's all sorts of supernatural stuff that's going on, and it's funny because in Lyra's world, it's like at least some of that seems to be commonplace, right? Like the the clockwork bugs that are get trapped in the tin that are like soul trying to escape or something. Like, what's that? Um, oh yeah, it's from some exotic part of the world, so we don't really have to explain it. But yeah, Mrs. Coulter has that. Like, I mean, I'm not sure that any explanation that he could give us would be satisfying. But maybe like something that just sort of like gives us just a hint of it, just to like satisfy something, and we can speculate more about it. Just all those things. Sort of, I guess the supernatural, it doesn't quite fit, and is kind of treated as like, oh yeah, that's a thing in this world.
Right.
Exploring more of that would be really good. And I'm not sure. In La Belle Sauvage, we went really deep in the fairy world, and in a way that maybe almost went too far, because I'm just like, how does that even make sense? And yet it's so much like a real fairy tale. So like it's wonderful, and it's also, I mean, there's other fairy stuff too. I mean, I guess there's a lot of fairy stuff. There's also sort of like, oh, never mind. Yeah, that's supernatural stuff. I can't just talk forever because I don't even know what I want. I want the depth. I want the romance. I want to feel like I want to be pulled into the world. Just a want for it. That's what I want more than anything else.
Yes, a really good story that gives you that experience of being carried away and having this kind of novelty, right, of experience as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think big part of that for me would be seeing more of those corners of the world sketched in, things like we're told about journeys to southern wilds and exotic places in Africa or the Far East. More of that would be
If
one.
you could capture the romance of those, like capture the romance of the North,
Yeah.
of North, could there be like an idea of Africa or something so interesting, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's that's kind of dangerous and kind of like sounding colonialist or something, but like, it also could be really romantic in an amazing way. And I don't know.
Well,
There's
that's okay. The final weird, spooky resemblance between Pullman and Tolkien, both of their fathers die in Africa,
yeah,
and so they both have that sort of experience of you know this this childhood figure who they look up to, maybe uh, taken from them at a young age, and there is a lot of Pullman's upbringing that involves him traveling, from one part of the world to another. So I think it'd be really interesting to see how that would pass through the filter of his storytelling. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
All right. Well, hey, thanks again. I will let you go, Kevin. I really appreciate you joining me and talking some of this through. I'd never thought of a lot of this stuff until you brought it up. And
Conversation, yeah.
yeah. All right. Best of luck with all your studies and classes and everything. And I'll hopefully see you around Signum and other places.
Absolutely. Well, it's great to meet you, and yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks again, Kevin Hensler, working on his PhD at Temple University. I always love talking to scholars and have had some interesting conversations lately on the Alexander Schmid podcast with a number of anime scholars and practitioners and theorists of RPGs, role-playing games, whether tabletop or computer-based. So if you like these kinds of interviews, conversations, go check those out at the Alexander Schmid podcast. The rest of this little segment here devote to some news and updates. Aside from that one I just gave you, I'll be posting some more on my blog soon, reviews and reflections on some of these literary criticism and academic papers. I mentioned I've been reading through his Dark Materials Illuminated, edited by Millicent Lenz, Carol Scott. I've also been reading Verlin Flieger's Splintered Light and Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. Those are just the first ones at the top of my stack that I've been trying to get to. Again, I would really recommend checking out the writing and speeches and things Pullman has given about his own work. The same goes for Tolkien, has a couple of critical essays, one called Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, the other on fairy stories, which are essential reading. Throw into that mix Owen Barfield's Poetic Diction and Saving the Appearances. I've read the latter, have not yet read the former, but hope to soon. And Francis Yates' work on the Renaissance and the occult tradition. Very, very keen on getting a couple of books of hers from interlibrary loan sometime soon. So I'll be posting those reviews on the blog, newschoolnotes.blogspot.com. I hope you check them out. I've also been working slowly on getting started with Signum Academy, which has been doing summer camps over the past couple of years and will soon be offering more open-ended and sort of modular course content for precocious students of all ages. I hope that you check that out. Signum Academy. You can find it through Signum University's website. And in context of out of school learning, there is a website called OutSchool where you can find a side project that I've been working on with Alex and Sarah called Night School, where right now we're offering a couple of classes on Tolkien's works, first the Two Towers, and then the Silmarillion, starting in about a month here. So please, if you're interested in taking a course on the Silmarillion or know someone who might like that, check that out on OutSchool, the Night School profile. Well, to finish up this week's second episode, thanks again for all your listens and for sticking with this project. I have got some short songs for you. First is Jerry. Next comes Trollesund. Then we have the Consul. Then the Bear. The Witches. And finally, Where's Your Balloon? I hope you enjoy.